Broke veteran inherited rotten orchard. His old German shepherd found a 350-manator secret underground. Ethan always thought the orchard broke his grandfather, until the night ranger stopped barking and started whimpering. Standing in the dirt intended for his inheritance, Ethan realized he hadn't been left land. He'd been drafted into a silent war. One that had been waiting in the dark for a fresh victim long before Ranger dragged him towards the trees. The bus hissed to a stop, like it was letting out its last breath. Ethan Hale stepped down with a single duffel over his shoulder, the same government-issued canvas he had carried through 2 tours and an unraveling marriage. The air in rural Oregon felt colder than he remembered, sharp enough to make the bones in his face ache. Maybe it was the altitude. Maybe it was the past trying to settle back into him. The station was barely more than a wooden shed and a flickering light. Beyond it, the land opened into miles of hollow hills and sagging orchards, 40 acres of dead apple trees. That was his inheritance. Not a house, not money, not even a goodbye note, just a parcel of forgotten land and a name scribbled inside a will. Ethan tightened his grip on the duffel and started walking toward the truck the lawyer had left for him. An old Ford with dents in places that suggested it had survived more fights than he had. He threw the bag into the back and climbed in. The ignition groaned a protest, but caught. As he drove along the gravel road, the orchard rose slowly into view, like something crawling out of the dark. Trees stood crooked in uniform rows, branches bare and grey. The house at the far end hunched under the weight of its own roof, windows clouded, porch leaning sideways as if one breath of wind might take it. He sat there for a moment, engine humming under him, wondering how things had gotten this bad, wondering how he'd become the kind of man who inherited ruins. He had been out of the Marines for 4 years. He had tried jobs, tried marriage, tried pretending the world hadn't gone quieter when bullets stopped flying. Debt had collected like dust. Then the job market had cracked beneath him. The call from the lawyer had felt like someone handing him a life he didn't ask for. When he stepped out of the truck, he heard a low rumble from the porch. A German shepherd, big and broad-shouldered, rose from the shadows. His coat was sable, streaked with grey around the muzzle, but his stance was unwavering, eyes locked on Ethan with an intelligence that made him stop cold. Ranger, the dog mentioned in the will. Responsible for the animal residing on the property. The lawyer had said, as if Ranger were a piece of furniture. But Ranger didn't look like something passed down. He looked like a guardian. Or a warning. Ethan raised his hand slowly. Guess you're part of the deal. Ranger didn't growl. He didn't blink. He just watched, head tilted slightly, as if assessing whether Ethan was someone worth letting in. Then, without breaking eye contact, he stepped aside from the door. Inside, the house felt like a sealed memory. The air carried dust and stale wood smoke. Sheets covered furniture as though someone had tried to hide the absence of life. Ethan dropped his duffel and opened the kitchen tap. Brown water sputtered before it cleared. Ranger padded in, nails clicking on the floor. He didn't ask for affection, didn't sniff around like most dogs. He simply sat near the doorway, tracking every movement with calm, practiced awareness. Ethan felt the weight of that stare more than he cared to admit, as if the dog already knew something he didn't. The first night came down heavy. Wind combed through the orchard like fingers dragging across a grave. Ethan lay awake on the old bed upstairs, staring at the cracked ceiling. Sleep hovered, but never landed. The silence in the house wasn't peaceful. It was the kind that made you aware of everything you had lost. He checked the time again. A little past midnight. That was when Ranger barked. Not a casual bark, not a lonely bark. This one was sharp, explosive, coming from deep in the chest. The kind of bark that tore a man out of sleep like a hand to the throat. Ethan shot upright, heart hammering, For a split second he didn't know where he was. His mind flared with desert heat and old sandstorms until Ranger barked again, dragging him back into the cold Oregon night. He grabbed a flashlight and hurried downstairs. Ranger was at the front door, muscles coiled, tail low, ears pointed sharply toward the orchard. Another bark. Then he scratched at the door, hard, as if demanding Ethan open it now. Ethan slammed the latch free. Ranger bolted. The cold hit Ethan's face the second he stepped outside. The orchard stretched in pale moonlight, rows of skeletal trees leaning in the wind. Ranger moved fast, weaving through them with purpose, not sniffing, not searching, leading. Ethan followed, boots crunching frost. "Ranger, slow down." The dog didn't listen. He stopped abruptly near the eastern edge of the orchard. Ethan's beam caught him pawing at the ground, barking hard, circling one spot with restless intensity. The soil there looked darker, softer, as if someone had disturbed it recently. Ethan crouched. "What do you see?" Ranger barked once, deep and urgent. Ethan pushed aside the loose dirt. His fingers struck metal, something small, something cold. He dug harder, breath quickening, until the corner of a rusted tin box emerged from the ground. It was old enough for the hinges to crumble when he pried them open with a rock. Inside wasn't a photograph, or a keepsake. Inside was a small Swiss bank key, gleaming faintly under the flashlight, and next to it, a folded piece of paper filled with letters and numbers in a coded sequence. Ethan stared at the items, cold settling deeper than the night air. Ranger stood beside him, rigid and silent, eyes fixed on the orchard as if expecting something else to move. Ethan whispered into the frozen wind, "This wasn't buried for me?" Ranger's low rumble answered him, deep and certain, and for the first time since he arrived, Ethan understood something with absolute clarity. The orchard wasn't dead. It was hiding. The morning felt heavier than it should have. Ethan woke to the smell of cold earth on his hands, the memory of the rusted tin box still pressing behind his eyes. He had left the key and the coded slip on the kitchen table, unable to shake the feeling that touching them again might change something he wasn't ready to face. Ranger lay near the door, not asleep, not relaxed, but alert. Watching. Waiting. Ethan felt those eyes before he even turned around. "You dragged me into something last night," he muttered, pouring water into a chipped mug. Ranger didn't move. He only flicked an ear, a silent acknowledgement. Outside, the orchard swayed in the weak Oregon light. The wind picked up the scent of wet bark and rot, the kind of smell that belonged to things left too long in the dark. Ethan stepped out, Ranger falling into stride beside him, with the quiet precision of a soldier shadowing his commanding officer. Except Ethan knew the truth. Ranger wasn't following him. Ranger was leading him. The dog stopped halfway down the orchard rows, head lifted, nose working the air. A low growl formed in his chest, slow at first, then tightening. Ethan felt it like a vibration through the ground. "What now?" he whispered. Ranger took off, not running wildly, not in curiosity. He moved fast and straight, like he was tracking something only he could sense. Ethan jogged after him, flashlight still in his jacket from the night before. The sun had barely risen, but the orchard shadows felt longer than morning allowed. Ranger reached the old storage shed before Ethan did, and planted himself in front of the warped wooden door. The building looked even worse in daylight. Boards bowed inward, roof sagging under moss and age, hinges eaten to powder. No sign anyone had stepped inside for decades, but Ranger growled, deep and warning, his gaze fixed on the base of the structure. Ethan approached slowly. "Easy. What is it?" Ranger didn't look away. He pressed one paw into the dirt, took a step toward the entrance, then stopped, as if he wanted Ethan to go first. The door resisted when Ethan pulled it, then groaned open on a breath of dust and mildew. Light slipped across the inside, revealing broken shelves, a collapsed workbench, and rows of empty crates. The smell of old oil seeped from the walls. Ranger stayed at the threshold, shoulders tense. Ethan stepped forward, boots crunching on debris. His flashlight beam swept the room. Nothing surprising, nothing dangerous. Until he saw the floor. The concrete was discolored in one patch near the back wall. Not chipped like the rest, not worn and cracked. Smooth, darker, almost too clean. Ethan crouched. "What the hell happened here?" Ranger padded in now, slow and deliberate, as if giving Ethan permission. He lowered his head to the patched concrete and sniffed, then let out another sharp growl. Ethan touched the surface. It was solid, but not original. A different mix, a different color. Someone had dug through the old slab, then filled it back in. Not recently, but not decades ago either. The work was rushed, uneven at the edges. Someone had buried something here. Ethan leaned back on his heels, pulse tightening. The orchard. The key. The code. Now a sealed floor. This wasn't just a farm. He whispered. Ranger suddenly stiffened. His head snapped toward the shed's entrance, ears pricked, body coiling like a spring. Ethan straightened instantly, scanning the doorway. Nothing. Only the orchard. Only wind. But Ranger stepped between Ethan and the open door, muscles braced, tail low, a soft rumble rising in his throat. He wasn't reacting to the wind. He was reacting to something else, something Ethan couldn't hear or see. "Talk to me," Ethan murmured. "What do you know that I don't?" Ranger moved to the patched section of concrete again and clawed once at the surface. Just once. Deliberate. Urgent. Ethan felt a chill crawl up his spine. "You want me to dig?" Ranger looked at him then, really looked. Eyes steady, bright with an intelligence that left no room for misinterpretation. Ethan ran a hand over the back of his neck. "You're serious." He stood, searching the shed until he found a rusted crowbar half buried under broken crates. He wedged it into the edge of the patched slab and pressed. The concrete groaned, cracked, then shifted. A thin line split down the middle. Ranger stepped back, watching every movement with unwavering focus. Ethan pried again. The slab lifted an inch, then two. Cold, stale air whispered out like something exhaled from the dirt itself. He froze. There was something beneath the concrete. Not dirt, not rock. A hollow space. Before he could lift the slab further, Ranger's growl snapped into a bark so sharp it cut through the shed like a blade. Ethan jerked around in time to see a shadow move across the orchard outside. A quick flicker, too fast to identify, but human-shaped. Ethan's breath caught. "Someone's out there." Ranger lunged toward the door, barking thunder into the morning. His entire body was a signal flare of warning. Ethan dropped the crowbar and sprinted outside, but the orchard was empty. No figure, no sound. Just trees swaying and the wind pretending nothing had happened. Ranger stayed locked on the far fence line, body trembling with restrained instinct. Ethan followed the dog's gaze but saw nothing except frost-coated grass. Whoever it was had moved fast. Too fast. Ethan stepped back into the shed. The cracked slab waited in the dim light, a quarter lifted, revealing a narrow void beneath it. Whatever was inside, it hadn't been touched in years, maybe longer. He knelt, palms sweating despite the cold. Ranger sat beside him, leaning in close, as if anchoring him. "This isn't random," Ethan whispered. "Whatever happened here, you saw it before I did." Ranger nudged Ethan's arm once, steady and strong. A man alone could have ignored a buried floor. A desperate veteran could have sold the land and walked away. But Ethan wasn't alone. He had Ranger, and Ranger had already chosen a side. Ethan pushed the slab again. The gap widened. A smell rose from the dark. Earth, oil, and something metallic, old and sharp. A truth hiding under rotten boards and dead trees. A truth Ranger had dragged him into. He swallowed hard. "All right, we go down this road together." Ranger let out one low bark. It sounded like agreement. The second night settled over the orchard with the same cold stillness, but Ethan felt different walking through the house. The patched concrete slab in the shed stayed printed in his mind, its dark edges like a bruise he couldn't stop pressing. Whatever was buried there wasn't going anywhere, but the unease inside him kept circling like a restless animal. Ranger sensed it. He paced the hallway, pausing often to look at Ethan as if checking whether he was ready for whatever came next. Ethan tried distracting himself with old newspaper clippings left in a drawer, faded photos of the orchard from decades ago, even a dusty box of tools. Nothing held. When midnight crept toward the windows, Ethan lay fully awake. Outside, the wind scraped through the branches, whispering the same hollow notes he had heard the night before. The house seemed to tighten with every gust. Then Ranger barked. Not the sharp alarm from the shed. This one was deeper, more urgent, echoing up the stairwell with a force that made Ethan sit upright instantly. Ranger's paws thundered across the floorboards. He barked again, a low roar shaking the space like a warning shot. Ethan grabbed the flashlight and bolted downstairs. Ranger wasn't at the door this time. He was already outside, disappearing into the orchard like a streak of living shadow. "Ranger!" Ethan called, sprinting after him. Moonlight washed the orchard silver, the rows of dead trees swaying like old bones. But at the far northern edge, just beyond where the land dipped into a shallow slope, one tree stood different. Full trunk, twisted but alive, leaves still clinging despite the cold. The only living apple tree among 40 acres of rot. Ranger circled the base of it, barking with wild insistence, paws tearing into the soil. Clumps of dirt flew behind him in frantic bursts. Ethan reached the tree, breathless. "Easy, boy. What are you digging?" But Ranger didn't stop. He dug harder, deeper, growling between each frantic sweep of his paws. Something was pulling him toward the earth like a magnet. Ethan dropped to his knees and pushed his hands into the soft dirt. The soil here felt different, freshly disturbed, too loose. Within seconds, his fingers scraped against something solid. Metal, cold and rough. Ethan dug faster. Ranger backed up just enough to give him room, but kept his body tense, as if guarding what lay beneath. Finally, the top of a small iron box emerged, edges eaten by rust, surface pitted from age. Ethan pulled it free. The box was heavier than it looked, as though the years had soaked into it. Ranger lowered his head, sniffing it once, then stepped back with an almost solemn stillness, as if he already knew the weight of what Ethan was holding. The clasp resisted at first, corroded shut by time. Ethan braced the box against his thigh and smashed the hinge with the flashlight. The metal snapped with a tired groan. Inside the box, wrapped in faded cloth, were two objects: a small brass key, cool to the touch, engraved with the precise script of a Swiss bank, and a folded sheet of paper, yellowed and fragile at the edges. Ethan unfolded the paper carefully. Lines of coded numbers and letters filled the page, arranged in a pattern too deliberate to be random. A chill crept up his spine. He knew enough about financial operations to recognize when something mattered, and this mattered. He stared at the key. A Swiss bank. A farmer in rural Oregon shouldn't have anything to do with Swiss banking. His grandfather's life savings combined wouldn't have paid for 1 year of fees, unless his story wasn't what Ethan had always believed. "Why did he hide this?" Ethan murmured. Ranger shifted closer, nudging Ethan's shoulder with his muzzle, grounding him. The dog's eyes held no confusion, only certainty. As if Ranger had known the orchard wasn't just dead land, as if he had been waiting for someone to see the truth buried in it. Ethan's breath steamed in the cold air. He looked back at the tree, the only living tree, a guardian, a marker. Not coincidence. Someone had chosen this spot for a reason. Before Ethan could process the weight of it, a sudden crack echoed from the far side of the orchard. A snapping branch, quick, sharp, too heavy to be wind. Ranger spun toward the sound, muscles coiling tight, a growl ripping from his chest. Ethan's heartbeat slashed into his throat. He raised the flashlight and scanned the rows. Shadows swayed, long and warped. Someone was out there, watching. The beam caught only branches and air, but Ranger kept growling, eyes fixed on a point Ethan couldn't see. "Come on," Ethan whispered. "We need to get inside." He tucked the key and coded note into his jacket, slammed the box shut, and grabbed Ranger's collar. The dog resisted one heartbeat longer, then relented, staying close as they moved toward the house. Halfway there, Ethan glanced back. The living tree stood alone, the disturbed soil glaring in the moonlight like an open wound. He couldn't shake the sensation that the orchard itself had shifted around him, that the land had peeled back one layer of its secrets, just enough to warn him. Inside the house, Ethan locked the door, breath unsteady. Ranger stood beside him, ears still angled toward the darkness outside. "Whatever this is," Ethan whispered, "it didn't start with us." Ranger blinked slowly, chest rising and falling with steady breaths. The silence settled around them, thicker than before. This wasn't just an orchard. This wasn't just inheritance. It was a trail. And Ranger had just revealed the first piece of it. The morning after the discovery felt colder than usual, as if the whole orchard had retreated into itself. Ethan didn't sleep. He lay awake listening to Ranger breathing at the foot of the stairs, steady and reassuring, the only thing that kept his nerves from unraveling. The Swiss key and the coded note sat on the table where he'd placed them, small enough to fit in a pocket, heavy enough to tilt the world. By sunrise, Ethan knew he needed answers before the questions pulled him apart. The orchard, the patched floor, the living apple tree, the shadow in the night. It all pointed to one truth. His grandfather had lived a life he never talked about. And dead men don't leave explanations. He grabbed his jacket, slid the key and note into the inner pocket, and whistled softly. Ranger rose immediately, shaking off sleep, ears alert as if he'd been waiting for Ethan to decide. "We're going into town," Ethan said. Ranger hopped into the passenger seat of the truck without hesitation. The drive to the town library took 40 minutes, winding between old mills and shuttered diners. Not many people were out, just a few early risers hauling sacks of grain or stacking firewood. Ethan used to love towns like this. Now they felt like rooms where someone had left a window open, letting ghosts slip through. The library sat behind the courthouse, a brick building that smelled like paper even from the outside. Ethan hesitated at the door. Walking into a firefight had been easier than walking into his own family's past. Inside, a middle-aged librarian with silver streaks in her hair looked up from her desk. Her name tag read, Joyce. She nodded politely, then her eyes drifted to Ranger. "Service dog?" she asked. Ethan hesitated, then nodded. Ranger sat tall, calm, the perfect soldier. Joyce smiled. Good boy. If she sensed something tense in Ethan, she didn't show it. "What can I help you find?" "My grandfather," Ethan said. Grant Hale. The name tasted strange in his mouth. He'd never spoken it aloud since the funeral. Joyce tapped a few keys. "There are employee records archived on microfilm, birth certificates, census logs. I'll bring everything we have." She returned with a ledger thick enough to be used as a doorstop and 3 reels of microfilm. Ethan settled at a viewing station, Ranger lying beside him like a warm shadow. The first reel flickered to life. Lines of employment entries scrolled across the screen. Grant Hale, bookkeeper. Temporary. Contract terminated. Grant Hale, external accountant. Contract dissolved. Again. New York, Seattle, San Francisco, Zurich. Ethan leaned closer, frowning. His grandfather had worked for multinational corporations, not local farms, and every position ended abruptly within a year. No explanation. No reason given. Joyce paused beside him. He moved around a lot. Looks like it, Ethan said. You'd be surprised how many temp accountants rolled through that era. Big companies hired them for cleanups. Cleanups. The word lodged in Ethan's mind. He turned back to the screen. An audit log appeared. Dated 1977. The page was marked internal use only. His eyes tracked the lines. Unaccounted transfer totals. 312 million USD potential off-ledger activity. Verified possible involvement of external contractor G. Hale. Case not pursued. Files sealed. The room seemed to shrink around him. Ethan gripped the machine, breath caught between disbelief and anger rising in his throat. $312 million. His grandfather's name beside it. Then nothing. A sealed file. A man erased from records. The same man who had spent the last 20 years pruning a failing orchard. The same man who died with barely enough savings to cover the funeral. The contradiction hit Ethan so hard he had to exhale slowly to steady himself. "Are you all right?" Joyce asked gently. "I'm fine." He lied. He wasn't. He scrolled again, heart tightening with each entry. Grant's name kept vanishing into blank spaces. No follow-up, no charges, no clearance, just silence. Why didn't he talk about any of this? Ethan whispered. Ranger pressed his head against Ethan's knee as if sensing every shift in his pulse. Anger churned in Ethan's chest. Had his grandfather stolen the money, hid it, been framed for it? Fear and doubt tangled together until Ethan couldn't separate them. He went through the reels twice more, taking notes. The pattern was unmistakable. His grandfather's trail didn't fade. It was scrubbed, removed deliberately. By early afternoon, Ethan stepped out of the library, feeling like he had walked out of a storm shelter into open sky. Ranger walked tight to his side, eyes scanning the parking lot. An old couple passed by and gave Ranger a long look. "That dog's got good instincts," the man said lightly. Ethan nodded. "He does." But Ethan's stomach churned as they walked to the truck. Ranger suddenly froze and stared across the street, ears snapping forward. Ethan followed his gaze. A black SUV idled at the corner, windows tinted too dark, engine running too quietly. Ethan felt his blood go cold. He took one slow step back, hand brushing Ranger's collar. The SUV didn't move. It didn't need to. It had already seen him. The moment stretched long and thin before the SUV rolled away without hurry, turning out of sight. Ethan stood there, pulse thudding hard. Ranger growled low, like a warning that had been building since last night. Ethan opened the truck door and whispered, "We're not imagining this, are we?" Ranger didn't look away from the empty street. He didn't have to. Something was watching them. Someone knew exactly what Ethan had found. And this quiet little town wasn't quiet anymore. The orchard suddenly felt less like land and more like the mouth of a story that had been buried for decades, waiting for the wrong person to pry it open. Or the right one. The orchard looked almost peaceful in the late afternoon light, but Ethan felt the tension hanging over the property like a storm cloud. Ever since the black SUV had appeared outside the library, he had been watching every shadow twice. Ranger watched them 3 times. Ethan was stacking firewood near the porch when he heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Ranger's ears snapped up before the truck even came into view. A glossy sedan rolled to a stop, far too polished for the dirt road. A man stepped out wearing a fitted charcoal suit and the kind of smile people practiced in mirrors. "Mr. Hale," the man called, adjusting his tie as if dust might insult it. "Hope I'm not interrupting." Ranger moved before Ethan did, placing himself squarely between Ethan and the stranger. His growl was low, steady, a living warning. The man froze mid-step. Ethan wiped his hands on his jeans. "Something I can help you with?" The man regained his composure and offered an easy, professional handshake Ethan didn't take. "Name's Victor Sloan. I represent a private agricultural investment group. We heard your property might be available." "It's not," Ethan said. Sloan smiled again. Thinner this time. "Everything has a price, and we are prepared to offer well above market value. Let's say 10 times appraisal. Cash, immediate transfer." Ranger barked, sharp enough to make Sloan jump. Ethan didn't flinch. "You usually wander rural Oregon offering bags of cash for dying orchards?" Sloan's eyes flickered. "We believe this land holds potential." "Potential for what?" "Expansion," Sloan replied smoothly. "New development, organic transition, tax offsets, the usual." Ethan stepped closer. "You need to work on your cover story. It's terrible." Sloan's face tightened for half a second before the practiced calm returned. "I'm simply trying to give you an option you can't refuse. You're a veteran. You're struggling financially. This could change everything." Ranger growled louder. "Leave," Ethan said. Sloan held his ground just long enough to send a message. Something cold moved in his eyes. "The offer won't last long. Men in your position rarely get second chances." Ranger lunged forward so fast Ethan had to grab the dog's collar. Sloan stumbled back, almost tripping over himself before scrambling toward his sedan. He slammed the door, started the engine, and sped down the road without the courtesy of a backward glance. Ethan watched dust rise behind the car, chest tight. Ranger stayed rigid until the car vanished. "That wasn't an investor," Ethan whispered. "That was someone who knew exactly what I found." Ranger nudged Ethan's hand, as if telling him the danger wasn't gone, just postponed. Night dropped early. The orchard darkened into a maze of shadows and brittle branches. Ethan tried to distract himself by examining the patched slab in the shed again, but Ranger wouldn't go inside this time. He stood at the doorway, staring toward the far western edge of the property, body taut. "What is it now?" Ethan asked softly. Ranger didn't bark. He just walked away, expecting Ethan to follow. Ethan grabbed a flashlight and stayed close. Ranger led him across the rows of trees to a part of the orchard Ethan hadn't explored yet. The ground dipped slightly, and tangled weeds choked what looked like a collapsed stone wall. Ranger stopped, paws scraping at the earth beside a pile of rotting boards. Ethan knelt. The boards were old, blackened with moisture, brittle to the touch. When he pulled one aside, a dark opening appeared beneath them. A well, or what used to be one. The hole breathed cold air upward. Ranger growled softly, circling the edge. "You think someone hid something down there too?" Ethan whispered. Ranger looked at him with that direct, unwavering stare. Ethan found a rope ladder curled nearby, half buried under vines. Old, but sturdy enough. He secured it to one of the stones, tested the weight, then started climbing down. Ranger paced nervously above him, letting out a quiet whine Ethan had never heard from him before. The bottom of the well wasn't full of water. It was dry, packed dirt and loose stones. Ethan shone the flashlight across it. Something metallic glinted behind a cluster of collapsed rocks. He pushed them aside carefully. A box emerged, tin and rusted but intact, bigger than the one under the apple tree. Ethan's pulse quickened. He carried it into the beam of light and pried it open with the edge of his knife. Inside lay stacks of bound papers wrapped in oilcloth. Ethan lifted one. Ledger pages filled with handwritten numbers, transfer amounts, dates, accounts, every line neat and precise. These weren't random records, they were financial logs, detailed accounts of money moved through off-book channels. Dozens of them, all in his grandfather's handwriting. Ethan's breath caught. He flipped to a page marked with a faded ribbon. At the top, written in steady script, were the words auxiliary totals. Beneath it, line after line documented funds that shouldn't exist in any legal system. Millions, then tens of millions, then more. Ethan swallowed hard as the truth hit him with the force of a blow. "These are the original records," he whispered. "Not stolen money, hidden money. Funds funneled out of corporations, not for personal use, not spent, preserved, moved, frozen. Someone had trusted Grant Hale with a fortune so large it could alter lives, and someone else had been hunting it ever since." Above him, Ranger barked once, the sound echoing deep into the stone walls. Ethan felt the urgency in it. "We're leaving," he said, grabbing the ledgers and climbing fast. Ranger backed up to give him room, tail straight like a warning flag. When Ethan reached the surface, he looked around instinctively. The orchard felt wrong. Too quiet. Too still. As if something had been disturbed. He tucked the ledgers under his arm and whispered to Ranger. "There's a reason Sloane came today. There's a reason he's watching. This land isn't worthless." Ranger stepped beside him, their shadows merging in the pale moonlight. The orchard was no longer just dying trees and forgotten soil. It was a vault, a battlefield, and someone out there was ready to fight for what lay underneath. Night closed over the orchard like a fist. By the time Ethan made it back to the house with the ledgers, his hands were shaking. Not from cold, from the truth pressing into him with every step. Ranger stayed glued to his side, eyes sweeping the dark rows of trees as if expecting something to move. Inside, Ethan dropped the ledgers on the kitchen table and locked every door. Ranger lay near his boots, tense but silent, watching Ethan with an alertness that felt almost human. Ethan flipped open the first ledger, scanning pages of numbers, transfers, codes. Everything he had seen in the library appeared again here, but clearer, more complete. His grandfather had kept meticulous records, not of theft, but of relocation. Funds pulled out of unreachable places, money meant to disappear. Then the door rattled. Ranger shot up like a triggered trap, body rigid. Ethan froze, listening. A scraping noise. Someone moving quickly, running. Ranger charged for the porch and exploded into the night with a roar. Ethan grabbed the tire iron by the counter and followed, heart slamming in his chest. He burst outside just in time to see Ranger slam into a figure in dark clothing near the orchard edge. The intruder hit the ground hard, scrambling, trying to reach a black laptop in the dirt. Ranger snarled and lunged again. The man stumbled to his feet, wheeled around, and sprinted into the rows of trees, disappearing into the dark. Ethan rushed to Ranger. "Let him go. Come back." Ranger obeyed instantly, bounding back to his side. Ethan knelt, gripping his collar with one hand, the tire iron with the other. The orchard was quiet again. Too quiet. Then Ethan saw it. The laptop. Abandoned. Half buried in the grass. Ethan picked it up, breath tight. Ranger circled close, still trembling with adrenaline. "Good boy," Ethan whispered. "You chased off the right guy." Inside, Ethan set the laptop on the table beside the ledgers. The device was dented, scraped, but still functional when he pressed the power button. The startup logo flashed, then a blank password screen appeared. He tried a few obvious guesses. Nothing. Ranger lay down, but didn't relax. His eyes stayed fixed on the doorway as if guarding Ethan while he worked. Ethan took a breath and tried something else. He plugged in the Swiss key. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the screen flickered. A file directory opened. Rows of folders, encrypted memos, surveillance logs, financial transfers. A logo scratched into one corner of the desktop background. Apex Circle. Ethan's stomach dropped. He clicked a file at random. A document filled the screen, heavily redacted, but a few lines remained visible. Asset recovery protocol initiated. Funds siphoned into unauthorized accounts. Custodian, Grant Hale. Target total, 350,000 USD. Beneficiary line to be terminated upon retrieval. Terminated. Ethan's pulse roared in his ears. He opened more files. Each was worse than the last. Emails between executives, orders, bank trails leading through Zurich, Singapore, New York. Every thread pointed to the same thing. Apex Circle wasn't a corporation. It was a shadow network. A syndicate with reach deep enough to bury men in paperwork or in dirt. And his grandfather had stolen from them. No, not stolen. Protected the money, moved it, locked it, buried the instructions across the orchard in pieces only a blood relative would ever connect. Ethan sank into the chair, breath uneven. He wasn't running from the law. He whispered. He was running from them. Ranger nudged his arm, sensing the shift inside him. Ethan clicked another file. Video surveillance footage. Grainy. Time-stamped. A shot of the orchard taken months before Ethan inherited it. Figures moving through the rows, searching, digging, failing. Apex had been here before. Apex had never stopped hunting. And Apex knew Ethan now held everything they wanted. A sudden realization hit so hard Ethan had to grip the table. Sloan wasn't a buyer, he was a retrieval agent. The attack earlier wasn't random. It was Apex trying again. Ranger growled toward the window, ears flat. Ethan turned off the laptop and pressed his forehead into his palms. His life had been a quiet disaster before this. Now it was a target, not because he was important, but because he had inherited a secret large enough to corrupt entire companies, enough to bury anyone who touched it. $350 million, hidden under his land, guarded by a man who had died before he could explain, protected by a dog who seemed to know the truth before Ethan did. He looked at Ranger, feeling something shift between them. "You knew," Ethan whispered. "You've been trying to show me since the first night." Ranger stepped closer, resting his head against Ethan's knee. A vow without words. Ethan rose slowly and looked toward the orchard through the window. The trees swayed under the moonlight, but the dark between them felt alive now. Watching. Waiting. Apex wasn't backing down. They would come. Again. And next time, they wouldn't run when Ranger charged. Ethan closed the curtains, checked the locks twice, then turned off every light except the one above the table. "We hold the truth," he said quietly. "And they want to bury it." Ranger's tail lowered, his stance settling into a guard position. Ethan sat down and pulled the ledgers closer. If Apex wanted a war, they would get one. But they weren't just fighting Ethan Hale. They were fighting Ethan and the one creature Apex had underestimated. A German shepherd who never barked without a reason. The orchard held its breath long before the attack came. Ethan felt it in the quiet, in the way the wind moved without sound, in the way Ranger paced the windows with a nervous precision Ethan had never seen in him before. Midnight was minutes away when Ranger stiffened, hackles rising like a crest of warning. Ethan followed his gaze. Headlights. Far down the gravel road. Too many. Too silent. Too coordinated. Apex. "Here we go," Ethan whispered. Ranger growled low, a sound pulled from instinct older than fear. Before Ethan could speak, the dog barked one sharp, explosive command and bolted through the dog door, hitting the yard like a missile. Ethan grabbed the tire iron, the .22 rifle he'd found in the closet, and a wrench he didn't need but felt better holding. He killed the lights, ducked low, and slipped out the back. 3 black SUVs slid to a stop at the edge of the orchard, engines humming like a single creature breathing in the dark. Doors opened. Shadows spilled out. Men in tactical black, moving with a discipline Ethan recognized from a past life. They weren't here to negotiate. One of them raised a handheld scanner. Another pointed toward the house. Move in, retrieve files, neutralize resistance. Neutralize. Ethan's pulse steadied. Not racing, not panicked, just steady. Combat rhythm sliding back into place like it had never left him. Ranger didn't wait. He hit the first man before his boots touched the soil, slamming him into the side of the SUV. The man cried out, weapon flying from his grip. Ranger snarled, teeth flashing, a guardian erupting into violence only when duty demanded it. "Dogs here! Contain him!" Someone shouted. Contain. They had no idea. Another man charged Ranger with a stun baton. Ethan rose from behind a stack of crates and cracked the tire iron into the attacker's ribs. The man dropped, breath exploding from him. Ethan grabbed the stun baton and rolled behind a pile of rotting apple bins as gunfire broke open the night. Ranger dove into the shadows, using the orchard's rows for cover. His silhouette vanished and reappeared between trees, each time closer to the enemy than they expected. He lunged at a second attacker, dragging him down hard. "Ranger, back!" Ethan shouted. But the dog already sensed the next threat. He positioned himself between Ethan and 3 advancing silhouettes, teeth bared, body braced. "Push forward!" A voice barked. "He won't take all of you!" Ethan's flashlight clipped on for half a second, just long enough to blind the nearest man. Ethan swung the stun baton, dropping him. Ranger leaped at another, dragging him to the ground with a ferocity that made the others hesitate. The hesitation saved Ethan's life. He dove for the shed, pulling the door shut behind him as bullets peppered the wood. He crouched behind the old workbench, breath tight. He needed a plan. Any plan. Ranger crashed through the shed's back opening moments later, fur bristled, panting but unhurt. He nudged Ethan's shoulder urgently. "Yeah," Ethan whispered. "I know. They're not stopping." Footsteps crunched outside. Ethan grabbed a rusted chain hanging from the ceiling, a leftover hoist, and looped it around the shed door handle just as someone slammed into it. "Force it!" a voice shouted. "No need," another voice replied calmly. The second voice froze Ethan. He knew that tone. Measured, cold, controlled. Victor Sloan. The door rattled hard. The hinges groaned. Ranger pressed himself between Ethan and the door, stance rigid, ready to take whatever came through. But before anyone breached the shed, something unexpected happened. A figure slipped between the attackers, speaking fast under his breath. "Stop pushing. You'll spook the dog." Sloan spat something Ethan couldn't hear, but the figure kept talking. "I said stop. The dog's dangerous. Back up." Ranger growled, but Ethan felt him hesitate. Something about the man's voice stirred recognition in the dog. The figure stepped into the moonlight. A younger man, maybe mid-30s. Scar on his jaw, eyes that didn't match the aggression around him. He looked at Ranger first, not Ethan. And Ranger stopped growling. The man whispered, as if speaking to an old friend. "I know you. You're Hale's shepherd. You're Ranger." Ranger's tail didn't wag, but he lowered his head slightly. Not submission. Recognition. Ethan rose a fraction. "Who are you?" The man didn't look away from Ranger. "Grant saved my life once. Years ago. I was a kid. Your grandfather pulled me out of a wreck in Washington. Ranger was with him. Same dog. Same eyes." Ethan frowned. Ranger's older, but he was trained for rescue before your grandfather retrained him for protection. He's old, but not done. The man exhaled slowly. "I owe him everything." Sloane's voice sliced through the moment. Mason, move aside, now. Mason, the man who recognized Ranger. Mason stepped closer, low enough so only Ethan heard. Listen carefully. Sloan wants the ledgers and the key. If you stay in this shed, you die. If you run west, there's an old irrigation ditch. Crawl through it. It'll shield you from thermal scans. Ethan stared at him. Why are you helping me? Because Grant Hale didn't steal that money. Mason whispered. He protected it from these men, and they killed him for it. Ranger let out a soft whine, as if sensing the truth behind the words. Mason jerked his head. Go, now. Before Ethan could answer, Mason shouted loudly, Shed's empty. They ran toward the barn. Sloan cursed. Fan out! Boots scattered in every direction. It was the only window they were getting. Ethan grabbed Ranger's collar. With me. They slipped out the back of the shed, just as Mason blocked Sloane's path for a precious heartbeat. Ranger led Ethan across the orchard in a low sprint, weaving through rows, ducking under branches, moving like he had rehearsed this escape for years. Gunfire cracked behind them, but the orchard swallowed the noise. The irrigation ditch appeared as a jagged, dark line in the ground. Ethan dropped to his stomach and slid in, Ranger close behind. The ditch was narrow, damp, and cold, but deep enough to hide them from drones and thermal scopes. They crawled, inch by inch, breath by breath. Behind them, Apex men swept through the trees with flashlights and rifles, but none of them looked down. When they were far enough, Ethan pulled himself onto solid ground and collapsed behind a fallen trunk. Ranger rested beside him, chest heaving. Ethan placed a trembling hand on the dog's neck. You saved me. Again. Ranger nudged him gently. Ethan looked back toward the orchard's dark silhouette. The war for the truth had begun. But they had allies they didn't expect, and Apex had just learned the one thing they should never forget. A man willing to die for the truth was dangerous. A man and a dog willing to protect it together were unstoppable. By dawn, Ethan and Ranger were 30 miles from the orchard, driving the old Chevy down a back highway toward the federal field office in Eugene. Ethan's hands were tight on the wheel, knuckles pale, but his mind was sharper than it had been in years. The duffel in the passenger seat held everything: the ledgers from the well, the Swiss bank key, the coded note, the stolen Apex laptop Mason had helped him escape with. Truth heavy enough to crush a corporation. Ranger sat upright in the back seat, ears scanning every sound, head lifting each time another vehicle passed. He hadn't rested since the fight. Neither had Ethan, but the dog's awareness kept Ethan anchored, the same way he had steadied him in the orchard during those first uncertain nights. At the highway sign for the federal building, Ethan turned off. Almost there, buddy, he said quietly. Ranger thumped his tail once, a soldier's acknowledgement. Inside the FBI office, chaos erupted the moment Ethan placed the duffel on the counter and slid the Swiss key across the table. The agent on duty stared, blinked twice, then called for backup so quickly the phone nearly slipped out of his hand. 2 supervisors arrived, then a financial crimes specialist, then a counterintelligence liaison. Soon Ethan found himself in a conference room, Ranger lying at his feet, 4 agents circling the table as Ethan laid out the story piece by piece. He showed them the ledgers and explained where he had found them. He opened the laptop and let the encrypted Apex folders speak for themselves. The moment they saw the internal memos, the temperature in the room shifted. One agent whispered, "This is bigger than a fraud case." Another muttered, "This looks like foreign laundering channels." A third tapped a finger on the ledger. 350 million, quiet for 40 years. Jesus. Ranger lifted his head every time voices rose, watching each agent as though judging whether they were worthy of hearing what his old master once protected. At last, the senior agent, A bald man with a navy suit and the calm of someone who had lived through too many storms, leaned forward. "Mr. Hale, you understand what you just handed us?" "Something that could get me killed," Ethan answered. "Something that could cripple a criminal syndicate," the agent corrected. "Apex Circle's been off our radar for decades. Untouchable. But this is gold!" Ranger nudged Ethan's boot, reminding him they weren't finished. They never were. The agent continued. "And this bank key, combined with these coded accounts, it unlocks the entire chain of transfers. Suspicious patterns go back to the 70s. Your grandfather pulled funds out before the network could hide them offshore. So he wasn't the thief," Ethan said softly. The agent shook his head. "No. Grant Hale froze their assets. He forced them to choke on their own operations." The weight in Ethan's chest cracked. It wasn't joy, not relief. Something heavier, a truth finally unburied. By noon, the FBI had mobilized a joint task force. Ethan watched agents swarm around printers, whiteboards, encrypted drives. He watched financial analysts tear through account histories with the fury of people who had waited decades for this chance. Every few minutes, someone came to Ethan with a question. Every time Ethan answered, Ranger lifted his head like a second witness. An hour later, phones began ringing. Apex accounts frozen, shell corporations locked, Swiss banking partners notified, federal warrants issued. By late afternoon, the first arrests hit the news. 3 Apex executives in New York, 2 more in Nevada, 1 attempting to flee through Vancouver. But they were all foot soldiers compared to the one Ethan cared about. Victor Sloan. Ethan watched the agents track his last known locations. One camera caught him dumping gear into a sedan in Portland. Another showed him crossing Highway 20 in a hurry. Then Ranger stiffened, nose lifting, as if sensing the chase from miles away. The senior agent's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, then at Ethan. "We got him." Ethan swallowed. "Where?" "Trying to cross the Oregon border. State Patrol boxed him in. He's in custody." Ranger let out a soft huff, almost like approval. Sloan. The man who had stepped onto Ethan's porch with a smile. The man who had threatened him, hunted him, ordered the raid that nearly killed him, now sat in handcuffs because of the truth Ethan and Ranger refused to bury. The agent leaned back in his chair. "Mr. Hale, you just dismantled a 40-year criminal network." Ethan exhaled, shoulders dropping for the first time in days. "No," he said quietly. "My grandfather did. I just followed the trail." Ranger nudged his hand again. Ethan scratched his ear, voice soft. "We followed it." The agent nodded towards the dog. "Whatever the case, your partner there is getting a medal from someone. Maybe all of us." Ranger blinked, steady and calm, as if none of this surprised him, as if he had been protecting that truth since the day Grant Hale brought him home. When the agents escorted Ethan and Ranger outside hours later, the sky had turned gold. Reporters were swarming the entrance, flashes popping like distant lightning. Ethan wasn't ready for attention. He wasn't ready for microphones or headlines or questions about a 70-year-old orchard hiding a fortune. But he walked forward anyway, Ranger matching his stride. Because the truth was finally free. Because his grandfather's name was finally clean. Because Apex Circle was done. And because the world was now hearing the part of the story no one expected. A broke veteran and a loyal old dog had just brought down a criminal empire. For the first time in months, the orchard breathed, not with the whispers of decay or the crunch of boots running from danger, but with the rhythmic hum of construction crews, the clatter of lumber, the rumble of new life being built from the bones of the old. Ethan stood at the top of the hill overlooking the land and felt something in his chest loosen, as if the place itself had been waiting all these years to exhale. The Hale Renewal Orchard. That was the name the court papers used when the judge confirmed his inheritance. The assets tied to Grant Hale's protected accounts were legally his now, clean, verified, and stripped from Apex's influence. Ethan hadn't wanted the wealth, not the way others did. Money had never solved the things he carried. But the orchard? The orchard could become something more than a graveyard. Ranger trotted beside him, slower than before, but still with that same proud, deliberate gait. His fur carried more grey now, especially around the muzzle, but his amber eyes burned with a clarity Ethan relied on. Workers passed by and paused to pet him, some kneeling to scratch his ears with gratitude that didn't need words. Ranger accepted it all with the patience of a king. Ethan looked out over the land being reborn. The old farmhouse had been gutted and rebuilt into a welcome centre. The barns were being converted into therapy rooms and job training spaces. Rows of dead trees had been cleared, replaced gradually with young saplings donated by local growers. Wooden trails wound through the acreage now, built wide enough for wheelchairs and lined with benches. Veterans came from all over Oregon and beyond, men and women who carried their own ghosts, their own storms. They walked into the orchard with shoulders tense, hands shaking, eyes wary. Ranger greeted each one. He didn't bark or jump. He just approached, steady and sure, pressing his head against their leg or lying down beside them, as if he could see every wound beneath the surface. Ethan watched it happen again and again. Some vets cried. Others laughed for the first time in years. Some whispered, "Good boy," in voices that trembled. Ranger didn't heal them, but he started the process, and that was enough. Ethan spent his mornings working the land, pruning new trees, teaching younger vets how to graft branches or run irrigation lines. Physical work grounded him. Structure steadied him. The orchard became his new unit, the place where discipline met purpose. But it was the evenings that changed him. Every sunset, Ranger would walk ahead of him toward the oldest apple tree, the one that had survived when everything else had rotted away. The tree stood tall now, nourished by real care and sunlight instead of neglect. Beneath it, the soil had long been filled in where they dug up the box that changed Ethan's life. Some nights, Ethan sat under the branches and talked to Ranger, not in the way some lonely people babble, but in the steady, low voice of someone finally releasing pieces of himself he had kept locked up since Afghanistan. He talked about the men he lost, the quiet nights where the silence hurt more than noise, the guilt he'd dragged across every state until it bled him dry. Ranger lay beside him, leaning his warm weight against Ethan's thigh, grounding him more effectively than any session in a sterile office ever had. One evening, as the sun dropped below the ridgeline and turned the orchard gold, Ethan closed his eyes and listened. Not to danger, not to memory, but to the soft rustle of leaves and the slow, steady breathing of a dog who had saved him long before Ethan realized he needed saving. A soft voice broke the quiet. "You built something beautiful here." Ethan opened his eyes. Dr. Mara Jensen, a trauma counselor who volunteered weekly, stood with her hands in her coat pockets, watching the orchard glow in the dying light. He nodded. "It's the land. It knows what it wants to be." Mara smiled. "It's also the man who chose to fix what was broken." Ethan didn't respond. He wasn't ready for praise, but the warmth in her voice didn't frighten him the way human kindness used to. Ranger rose and walked between them, tail wagging once before pressing his head into Mara's hand. She laughed softly. "He approves." Ethan watched the two of them. Something softened in his chest. A new possibility. Fragile, but real. When she left, Ranger came back to Ethan's side and nudged his knee. "You think I should talk to her more?" Ethan asked. Ranger stared up at him, unimpressed with the hesitation. Ethan chuckled under his breath. "Yeah, Maybe. The orchard lights flickered on down the valley. Voices drifted from the new cabins. Someone started a campfire near the south field, and laughter carried on the wind. A place once filled with rot and silence was now filled with life, with hope. Ethan knelt and wrapped an arm around Ranger, pulling him close. The dog leaned in, breathing steady, eyes soft. "We're doing it, old man." Ethan whispered, "We're actually doing it." The orchard wasn't a hiding place anymore. It wasn't a graveyard of secrets or a battlefield waiting for intruders. It was a beginning, a sanctuary, a legacy his grandfather never had the chance to build himself. And as the night settled gently over the Hale Renewal Orchard, Ethan realized something he hadn't believed in a long time. He wasn't broken anymore. He was growing again, just like the land he'd inherited, just like the dog who had never once let him fall. The orchard glowed in the soft light of late afternoon, the kind that made everything look calmer than it truly was. Volunteers moved between the new cabins, veterans walked the gravel paths with steady steps, and the faint smell of apple blossoms drifted through the air. The place no longer resembled the forgotten land Ethan first stepped onto months ago. It had shape now, purpose, breath. Ranger lay on the porch in front of the main hall, paws crossed like an old sentinel guarding the threshold between what the orchard used to be and what it had become. His muzzle had more silver now, threads of age woven into the fur, but his posture carried the same quiet authority, the same unwavering truth. A small crowd formed around Ethan as a local news team arrived for a feature story on the Hale Renewal Orchard. Cameras clicked. A boom mic dropped. The reporter, a woman with warm eyes and a practiced calm, stepped forward. "Mr. Hale," she said, "your story has reached a lot of people. A broke Marine inheriting a dead orchard, discovering a criminal empire, rescuing lost funds, turning this place into a sanctuary for veterans. It sounds like something out of a movie. But it all started with your dog." Ethan smiled faintly. "It always starts with him." She nodded toward Ranger. "So I have to ask, what do you think Ranger knew that first night, when he barked and pulled you out into the orchard?" The question hung in the air, simple yet loaded with everything that had happened. The orchard fell silent behind them. Even the volunteers paused. Ethan turned toward Ranger. The dog slowly lifted his head, amber eyes meeting Ethan's with the same sharp clarity that had cut through darkness on that first night. In those eyes, Ethan saw every step they had taken together. The fear, the danger, the discovery, the truth. He knelt next to Ranger, resting a hand gently on his shoulder. "He didn't bark for danger," Ethan said quietly. "He barked for the truth." Ranger let out a low, confident woof. Not loud, not sharp, just one steady sound, firm enough to mark the final line of a story he had carried long before Ethan understood it. The reporter smiled, but there was something soft in her expression. Something moved. The cameraman lowered the rig just a little, as if giving space to the moment. Ethan continued, voice lower now. "I survived war, but I didn't survive coming home. Not really. This dog. He found the things I couldn't face. He dragged me toward answers I didn't want. And he saved lives, mine included. Everything you see here exists because he refused to give up." Ranger shifted closer, pressing his head against Ethan's leg. The crowd watched quietly, some wiping at the corners of their eyes. The reporter cleared her throat. "If there's one thing you want viewers to take away from this story, what would it be?" Ethan stood, looking out across the orchard that had transformed into a place of healing. Veterans laughed near the fire pit. New saplings trembled in the breeze. The old apple tree, the one that held a buried box of secrets, stood in full bloom. He took a breath, that sometimes the loudest cry for help doesn't come from a person. Sometimes it comes from a dog who refuses to let you drown, and if you listen to him, he just might lead you back to life. Ranger stood beside him, straight-backed, regal, as though he knew exactly what Ethan was saying. The cameras clicked again. The moment settled like dust, warm and lingering. Ethan bent down once more, scratching behind Ranger's ear. "You kept the truth alive," he whispered. "And you kept me alive, too." Ranger leaned into the touch, eyes closing for a brief, contented moment. The reporter ended the segment with a smile. Volunteers applauded softly. A few veterans approached to pet Ranger, each one touching him with the reverence of someone greeting a guardian. As the news van rolled away and the orchard slipped back into its gentle rhythm, Ethan sat on the porch beside Ranger. The sun dipped lower, turning the land gold. Voices rose from the cabins. Laughter broke across the field. Legacy lived here now, not in money, not in dusty ledgers or buried secrets, but in every life that stepped onto this land and felt the weight on their shoulders lighten. Ethan rested a hand on Ranger's back. "Ready for the next chapter?" he asked. Ranger huffed once, as if to say he'd been ready long before Ethan ever was. Ethan looked into the camera lens of a volunteer filming behind them, and let the final words fall with the fullness of everything they had lived. "What's your story with a loyal pet?" The screen faded in the mind's eye, but Ranger's bark echoed like a signature, a promise that some truths never die,